Hello there, welcome to saberduelgaming, where we always take the high ground. Now, it wasn't that long ago that I took a look at this all-time classic, Tetris on the Nintendo Game Boy, perhaps the most famous incarnation of the game ever made. But as I've explored my catalogue of games on the Nintendo Switch, looking at a load of those retro classics, I delved into the Nintendo Entertainment System and, to a degree of surprise, I realised, hey, Tetris is on there too. But is it as good? And was it as successful? Well, let's find out as we take a look at Tetris, a retro review on the Nintendo Entertainment System. Tetris on the Nintendo Entertainment System actually has a degree of controversy behind it. You see, around the same time as Nintendo had the exclusive rights to make this game for the console and home computers, I believe, Atari had actually just released their own version of Tetris, which they ended up having to pull from shelves. They had no idea that Tetris was exclusively licensed for Nintendo. This would have been a bad look on its own. However, what made this situation fairly worse was that the original Atari game had already been reviewed by most gaming publications, and pretty much all were quite adamant that the Atari game was far superior. They even went on in many publications to say that this was a real shame for gamers that they were only going to get to play the Nintendo version of the game. That's quite a roadblock for a game to have to overcome. The game was also massively overshadowed by its own baby brother in the Nintendo Game Boy version of the game. The game potentially fit a handheld console far better, but that doesn't mean the game itself isn't good. In fact, many would say that on a bigger screen it has a lot of advantages, so let's see what those are. Well, obviously the main gameplay is the same as it is on the Nintendo Game Boy. We have a bigger screen because this will be played on your television, so there's scope for a little bit more variety. We have down the left hand side this section that shows how many of each piece have come down throughout the game. That's a nice little feature, but realistically it doesn't change anything. The main improvement over the Game Boy version of the game is the colour. It's a far more colourful game to a degree. Yes, the blocks are more colourful, but that tends to come in waves. There's a palette of colours, and at different points throughout the game, that palette will change to a different palette. It's not actually all full colour all at once. We get mostly greens, then mostly blues, then mostly reds. Still, it's quite cool, and it does liven things up in a game which is designed to look very basic. The downside to the visuals are the massive amounts of just grey space, which doesn't look too flattering. While there's very little in the way of sound effects, Tetris has been synonymous with some really good tunes, and this one does have a few. The Nutcracker Suite, I believe it's called, is actually in this as well. However, I found myself thinking it wasn't quite right. The music itself is fine, but it's not the Tetris music. Unfortunately, the Game Boy version of the game was so successful that the music in that, which isn't in this, just feels like the real Tetris music. This just isn't quite the same. But that said, the music itself is still perfectly fine. So then the first key question is, how was the game actually received when it was first released? Interestingly enough, I found very few actual score ratings for the game. All Game Magazine gave it 4.5 out of 5, which is quite a high score, but other than that, there was very few reputable and known publications I could find that gave it a direct score. However, it was generally praised as a game. However, when looking into its legacy, the vast majority of the information out there is just how everybody deems the Atari version of the game to be far superior to this, which is kind of a shame. It feels like a bit of a shadow looming over what is a very good puzzle game. Within the first 6 months, it sold 1.5 million copies. And I'd really like to compare this success against the Tetris version of the game, but it's really hard to. The Nintendo Game Boy came with Tetris, so every Game Boy owner had a copy of Tetris. That was classed as a purchase, and Tetris was at one point in Europe bundled in with the Nintendo Entertainment System. Unfortunately, whenever a game is bundled in with the actual console, it becomes near impossible to really accurately identify just how successful the game was based on sales. So, how about its legacy now? How does it stand up to modern scrutiny? Well, to be clear, I have no nostalgia goggles with this one. I'd never actually played Tetris on the Nintendo Entertainment System, only on the Nintendo Game Boy. And I have to say, playing it for the first time, initially I went in thinking, this was going to be an easy review to make. That was literally my thinking, just being honest. I thought this will be some basic footage and I can talk over it. Obviously, looking into it, I found there was a lot more backstory behind this game. Heck, the recent Tetris movie is actually based around the complexities of Nintendo acquiring exclusive rights for this game and the impact it made on the gaming industry as a whole. However, putting all that to one side and just looking at the game, really isn't much to say. Just like the Nintendo's Game Boy Classic, this game is a very simple game with only 2 game modes. But the Nintendo Game Boy version of the game does come with some nostalgia and maybe a little bit more charm. This version of the game, whilst it has a little bit more going on the screen, doesn't feel quite as fun. It feels a little bit more sterile. The bigger screen actually hinders the game in some ways for me because what we're actually focused on takes up about 1/3 of it. The rest of it is just there taking up space and not looking that fantastic while it does it. That said, I will say the Tetris gameplay remains as compelling as ever, and whilst I was reviewing this game and compiling footage, I did on multiple times just stop recording footage and focus on playing the game, so it still remains fun. The problem is, I think I'd still enjoy the Game Boy version more. Despite the colour system on this, the music, whilst lovely, is just not Tetris. At least to me, it doesn't feel like the real Tetris tunes. And if I was looking for something a bit more modern, there are a whole bunch of modern versions of Tetris that would be massively surpassing this version of the game. So overall, whilst this classic certainly has its place in gaming history, solely as a game, it's really not stood the test of time especially well, despite the simplistic nature of the game itself. Giving this one a score was really tricky for me because the actual gameplay is perfectly fine and it's still really addictive. However, this version of the game feels so obsolete to me. If I fancied playing Tetris, there's no real chance that this is the game I would go for, or the version of the game I would go for. I feel really harsh with this score, but I feel like I can only give it a 5.5 out of 10. Maybe that is really harsh, maybe it deserves something much better than that, but for me, I can't imagine myself going back and playing this version of the game again. But let me know, have I been too harsh? Regardless, I think this game has a legacy, and one that will be remembered for a very long time. Until next time, I hope you have a fantastic day, and of course, take the high ground.